Well, thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many faces and familiar faces at that. We are excited today, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, together with a number of partners, are really excited to present our newest work, integrating the embodied carbon work that CNCA has been leading for several years. As folks know, we, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, an alliance of 22 global cities leading the charge towards carbon neutrality, have been kind of charting the course in the realm of embodied carbon policy, how to reduce embodied emissions in the built environment for several years now. And we are very excited to be able to bring a new lens to the policy development and implementation that we have been leading. This new workbook we are presenting today together with our partners, the Embodying Justice in the Built Environment, Circularity In Practice, goes a long way towards really contextualizing the embodied carbon policies and work that our cities and many other cities have been pioneering, contextualizing it in the lens and frame of equity and justice. So we're very excited to share this with you all today. Joining us from our partners are the Director of Just Places Lab, Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University, Dr. Jennifer Minner, Dr. Jocelyn Poe, Director from Reparative Praxis Lab at the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University as well, Professor Felix Heisel, Director of Circular Construction Lab, Department of Architecture at Cornell University, Gretchen Wirth, Program Director from the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, and Lauren Zimmerman, Sustainable Building and Deconstruction Specialist at the Portland Bureau of Planning Sustainability in Oregon. So a great team that has put in a tremendous effort to make a really innovative workbook and guide for cities to really think in a new way about embodied carbon policy and how to squarely sort of center equity and justice as they pioneer these new pathways. So I'm very excited to kick it over to our partners for an introduction and presentation. And I'd just like to note that I'm taking the place of Tracy Morgenstern, who really should be moderating this panel. Tracy leads our climate justice work at CNCA, but her voice has been giving a little challenge. So I'm supporting, but this is really the work that Tracy has been leading. And so hopefully she'll be able to jump in throughout as well. So with that said, Jenny, I'll turn it over to you for more proper introductions and to kick off the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. Thank you, Simone and Tracy and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance for your enthusiasm and support for this project. And thanks also to everyone involved. I also want to mention Ash Kopensky, who is a co-author of this work. And really, we're indebted to the ongoing work of many others who are dedicated to achieving a just and equitable built environment, from activists, nonprofits, advocates, laborers, those in local government, state, federal, and entire social and environmental movements. And thanks to those of you in the audience who have joined us, who may be doing this work and want to engage in it. So before I get started in talking about the guide and workbook, I'd like to give our land acknowledgement. I'm presenting today from Ithaca, New York, at Cornell University. And the Cornell University's Ithaca campus is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America, and we acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And I invite you and encourage you to reflect on Indigenous presence and futures wherever you may be. again, I'm sitting here at Cornell University. I'm in the Department of City and Regional Planning, the Director of Graduate Studies. So if you're interested in advanced studies in planning or historic preservation or regional science, give me a shout out. And Felix Heisel is within the architecture department, also within the College of Architecture, Art and Planning. If you'd like to go to the next slide. So I direct the Just Places Lab, which is a transdisciplinary platform for research and creative action. We're centered on memory, imagination, and the just care of places. And this project falls right within our mission. We work on a variety of projects, but the partnership with CROWD, which is Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development, is among our most important collaborations. We do a variety of other projects, and I engage with students within the Just Places Lab and other collaborating researchers, many of whom have been engaged in either authoring, illustrating, or otherwise contributing and reviewing this guide and workbook that we'll be presenting today. They're all outlined in yellow. If you can go to the next slide. Great. And recently, just last year, the Just Places Lab led efforts to draft a collaborative document, again, put out by CROWD. This is one that CNCA members may be particularly interested in, which is toward building sustainable communities and circular economies. And this really fits hand in glove with the project that we'll be presenting today. And I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Jocelyn Poe to talk a little bit about her work.
Hello, everyone. I am the director of the Reparative Praxis Lab, a new lab here at Cornell AP that focus on building reparative praxis. We look at our approaches, theories, methodologies that seek to remedy past injustices while creating more just futures. We partner with local communities to work through specific issues they're having from a justice lens and from a historical trauma lens, and think about ways of healing and care and repair that can be implemented at the local level and speak to national and global policies. This work ranges from working with local school districts around school closures and land use, to building sustainable and just food systems work. Our goal is to contribute to a framework of reparative praxis, specifically for planners, policymakers, and people who engage in the built environment, to think through what it means to have programs, practices, and processes that focus on repair. And I will turn it over to Felix.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you all in this meeting today. My name is Felix Heisel. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture, and the lab that I'm directing is the Circular Construction Lab, which really tries to shift the paradigm from linear material consumption towards a circular economy within an industrialized construction industry. As these labs are, we really understand ourselves as the sort of transdisciplinary and trans-program sort of hub and platform, much of the work, similar to how Jenny introduced it, really goes to the many authors that stand behind this this presentation. And I'm really grateful to all the students that are contributing to the work that we're doing. And our work really addresses two different aspects of circularity. On the one hand side, we're really curious of what we can do with the existing built environment, how we can understand existing materials, existing buildings, as a resource for future construction in all the many ways that circular economy can offer that. And on the other side, we're questioning how can we design buildings differently moving forward, so that future buildings don't run into the same end of use scenarios as current buildings do. And we'll talk about some of these aspects later in the presentation. And I'll hand it over to Gretchen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I am Gretchen Worth, and I direct the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning. And the Christopherson Center works across New York State to support communities in their planning efforts to achieve a more equitable, climate resilient built environment. And so the workbook that we've developed for CNCA fits very nicely into that nexus of issues that we are supporting New York State communities on. Next slide. We do a number of programs at the Christopherson Center, and CROWD, as Jenny mentioned earlier, is one of those. So CROWD stands for Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development. The Christopherson Center, the Just Places Lab that Jenny runs, and the Circular Construction Lab that Felix runs are among the founders of this collaborative network that was started in 2020. There are other partners from preservation, from salvage and reuse. And we all came together to address and create a more sustainable built environment in New York State by creating a circular construction economy. So, as I mentioned, we are a collaborative network. We are preservationists, planners, professionals, university faculty, students, those in the building trades, and many more. And at the core, we are looking to support building and building material reuse so that the benefits environmentally, socially, economically can be realized by all communities in New York State, which is our focus area. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we began with a small group of founding partners in the Finger Lakes region of central New York. Over the past few years, we've expanded so that we now have participants in CROWD from virtually every region of New York State. And there's 4 main areas that CROWD works with. That include policy development, both at the local, county, and state levels, education and engagement around circular construction economy, workforce development that is equitable and just, and research and data analysis. Back to you.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. Thanks, everyone. So we've come together to draft and now present Embodying Justice in the Built Environment, Circularity in Practice, which is a guide and workbook. It's really something that we drafted for local governments and also community organizations who are seeking to center justice and equity in their work to build a circular construction economy, to build carbon neutral futures, and to see transformation in the way that cities do business and govern. And work with communities. So this guide and workbook offers the Embodying Justice framework, which Jocelyn will describe in more detail to support justice-oriented practices in the built environment. And we really came together with the belief that redressing injustices are really integral to transitioning cities toward carbon neutrality. So we began this conversation with Simone and Tracy around the embodied carbon policy framework that the CNCA has developed and that you hopefully are using now. If you can go to the next slide. So in our process of crafting the guide and workbook, we wanted to understand what policies are being promoted. We honed in specifically on waste and circularity and began thinking about the policies from a justice and equity perspective, specific to this section in the policy guide or framework. And this is to point out our approach was really centered on waste and circularity. There are many other impact areas that are covered in the guide, and we hope in future iterations to take a close look at zoning and land use, public procurement, municipal policies, infrastructure development, these other domains. We touch on some of them, but this guidebook and workbook is really centered on waste and circularity. So in our process, we met with both CNCA and non-CNCA city and community leaders. That includes Lauren Zimmerman, who will be joining us today to talk about experiences in Portland, Oregon, Zara from Vancouver, BC, and others. This Historic Preservation Office of the City of San Antonio, the Esperanza Center for Peace and Justice, and a University of Texas research group who is doing really important work in San Antonio. Our crowd partners, which reach across New York State, and Rethos in Minneapolis. This consisted of interviews and also deep dives into the guide and workbook. Okay, so we'll be stepping through in this presentation how to use the workbook, and this graphic representation from the Circular Construction Lab illustrates well the three main strategies that we'll be discussing, from new construction to resource management and reuse to alternatives to demolition. And then within the graphic, you can see the W's, which are the policies mentioned in the embodied carbon framework that's the CNCA has produced. And we recommend users to really carefully review and apply the questions, and I'll describe what those questions are. They're really meant to bring awareness to justice issues and to prompt users to pursue solutions that are appropriate for your community. So it's about making notes, making connections, connecting ideas. So early in the guidebook, you'll see a crosswalk. We will be describing each of the elements of the Embodying Justice framework and how those are applied to these three strategies of alternatives to demolition, resource management, and new construction, and then how those crosswalk to the CNCA's policy framework and how it relates to life cycle assessment frameworks, from the product stage of extraction through construction, through use and maintenance, and then end of life, and hopefully continued life in a circular economy. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Jocelyn Poe to talk a bit about the Embodying Justice and Waste and Circularity section.
Thank you, Jeannie. So the guide and workbook is divided into these kind of three categories. The first one, we discuss embodying justice and waste and circularity. We go through what's embedded justice, and it's really, I would think about it as a theory kind of section. The middle section is about applying the embodying justice framework, and it's really the workbook. It's where you're able to implement through going through this process of deep questioning and contextualizing these questions in your local communities. And then finally, we have a practice section that focuses on organizations across the US that are doing this type of work and kind of what are they learning, how are they implementing it, and what are things that we can gather from them. And we hope as people begin to use this workbook, there would be more, we can build kind of a repository of practice stories. So I'm going to walk through the first section on embodying justice and waste and circularity. And we really needed to begin this project rooted in understanding what is injustices and how they are embedded in the built environment. And it isn't an isolated policy or relationship that implements injustice, whether policies, practices, processes, relationships, and societal structures that work together to create and maintain injustices, impacting different populations and places unevenly. We provide an overview of injustice, which includes legacies such as redlining and dispossession, harmful extraction, toxic dumping, and oppressive conditions. Given the scale of embedded injustices, we needed a definition of embodying justice that is just as pervasive and aggressive as the injustices we're trying to combat. To do this, we ground this framework in these guiding principles of justice. First, justice is reparative. It seeks to correct. Second, justice is fair. It deals with the equitable distribution. Third, justice must center community and collective action. Fourth, justice is not an abstraction, whether it is grounded in place and is grounded in specific context, which include all of the things associated with place, social structures, networks, human capital, etc. And finally, justice is a process, not an endpoint. It is a continual practice of reflection, acknowledgement, and action. With these principles, we define embodying justice as a continuous process that recognizes and remedies past and present harm within the built environment while working towards just futures. The Embodying Justice framework honors the pervasive nature of injustices and justices, encouraging practitioners and policymakers to consider a more comprehensive approach as it applies the principles of justice to 5 domains: community impacts, economic impacts, labor and workforce, historical context, community engagement, and improvement. These domains emerge from a systematic analysis in which the principles were applied to waste and circularity policies. It is important to note that while this framework is organized by these areas of impact, these domains are inherently interrelated and their boundaries are not fixed. They serve as guidelines to organize discussions around justice in ways that move from a singular focus to a systematic approach. So now we use this framework and we apply it to the waste and circularity strategies that are in those 3 domains Jeannie mentioned. So I will turn it back over to you, Dr. Minner.
Thank you. So this component of the guide and workbook is split into 3 specific areas or strategies. And I'll describe the alternatives to demolition in more detail in a minute. Gretchen is going to speak to resource management and waste. And then Felix is going to talk through new construction. Now, within each of these sections, we have pages such as this that ask the city, agencies, community leaders to look at each of those strategy areas and ask questions. So as Dr. Poe mentioned, there are the justice considerations, or J's, and you can see the J's are outlined in relation to each of those questions. And so we have a list of questions that we encourage city leaders to ask themselves to think through when considering the properties that are public and that they maintain, their programs and policies from incentives and regulations. And then each of those questions has subdomains, and we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of those in a minute. I also want to pause and focus in on one of the earlier questions. So this is in the maintenance, preservation, and refurbishment section, which is part of the alternatives to demolition. And I've highlighted here priority populations. So priority populations throughout the workbook are those who have suffered the burdens of discrimination, unjust and inequitable practices, policies, laws, and societal norms. So we highlight here Indigenous, Black, people of color, immigrants, and other communities and identities that have been marginalized and underrepresented. So the way that this first strategy area is broken out, it comes from a conceptual framework or diagram that is building reuse to waste. So within the alternatives to demolition section, we're talking about the extension of building and material life. That is the widest part of the pyramid that you see on the right-hand side. So that's extension of life, and it's the most preferred. So at the very top, we have maintenance, preservation, and refurbishment. It's often the most sustainable approach towards managing existing building stock, materials, and working toward carbon neutrality. And this consists of the upkeep and repair that extends the life of buildings in place, thus reducing the necessity for demolition, deconstruction, or extensive renovations. It's really a strategy that is about conserving embodied carbon in place. And there are all sorts of justice considerations within preservation programs, within any of the programs that intersect with what we're calling NPR within this schematic. The next section down consists of other extension of building life programs and practices. This includes adaptive reuse, the repurposing of existing buildings for a new use that may take a bit more intervention, overbuilding and building extension, which retains large portions of existing materials and buildings in place, but extends them, and whole building relocation, which is moving an intact building from one site to another. And then third within the section, deconstruction and salvage, which deconstruction is the careful dismantling of a building to maximize the recovery of valuable materials for reuse, which is higher and better than recycling, which Gretchen will also mention in the next strategy section, which is resource management. So continuing with the building reuse to waste hierarchy, adopting alternatives to demolition and waste creates new opportunities to consider justice and equity. For example, considering within city offices of historic preservation, housing authorities, planning and sustainability offices, and code enforcement programs, and whether they're working together or against addressing justice and equity within their work. And here I call attention to the fact that dramatically reducing embodied carbon also speaks to the refurbishment and reuse of buildings, of existing assets, and there's many parallels here and also some differences. But we encourage you to extend from the work that the CNCA does and consider justice and equity within these alternatives to demolition. Okay, and I'd like to turn it over to Gretchen to continue to talk about the second strategy section.
Thanks, Jenny. So the second strategy of resource management and waste demolition it follows the materials from their hopeful reuse and distribution within a community, And this means using these materials that have been deconstructed and salvaged at their highest and best use. And we're talking about both building materials as well as the soil that these buildings sat on. The next section within the strategy is recycling. And recycling is different from reuse. Recycling is reuse of these materials, but at a lower value and utility, where they've lost their integrity, really. And then finally, this is the least preferred of the reuse to waste hierarchy, as Jenny was mentioning previously, and that's the demolition and waste component. It's when valuable materials from our buildings are instead incinerated and landfilled and become waste, dying a slow, horrible, and unnecessary death in landfills or a fast conflagration in an incinerator. And so within this idea of material reuse, you know, there are a lot of reasons. For those of you who are not familiar, there are a lot of wonderful reasons for reuse of materials. Reuse of materials reduces the carbon emissions from extraction and manufacturing of new materials, and also reduces the potential abuses of people and communities who are involved in these extractive and manufacturing processes. It also diverts materials from our landfills and incinerators, and it offers enormous opportunities to embed justice into policies and practices that are related to reuse. Reuse also invites preservation into this consideration. It helps maintain neighborhood fabric, it honors community histories, it encourages more equitable distribution of both the benefits and the burdens, and it facilitates inclusive public participation and decision-making. So in this section, I won't go through all of the questions, but there are some main areas that this section is addressing, regardless of material reuse, recycling, or demolition and waste. And one is about addressing the priority stakeholders in the reuse aspect. For instance, who has access to the reclaimed materials? Priority populations, community organizations involved in creating equitable public space, agencies or organizations who are creating affordable housing. We also include questions to consider around sites, whether it's a reuse facility and considering how to make that easily accessible to everyone. A landfill, and acknowledging that landfills have historically been located in vulnerable communities and the burdens that that places on those communities. Or a demolition site, and recognizing the effects of demolition on the community, from both a health and safety consideration to the destruction of neighborhood fabric, to the harms of a big empty lot sitting there for a very long time. We also talk about equitable and just workforce development and small business creation, and how city governments can support these efforts and include fair labor considerations, encourage the hard to employ and underemployed populations, offer accessible training. We also think about, and ask you to think about, more inclusive efforts and inputs that can include community organizations, that can give voice to neighborhood groups, to individuals, as well as the private sector. And finally, how are we communicating about these programs and policies? What platforms and languages are we using to disseminate information on opportunities, to provide educational outreach, to capture and share the histories of the reclaimed materials, to amplify community histories that have previously been excluded or underrepresented? Felix?
And then as the third part of this chapter, we talk about new construction, another integral part of our industry, but really thinking through how can also in new construction circularity, but not only circularity, but equally important, just the question of justice and equity be part of that consideration. And so we decided to structure this chapter in following the 5 steps of the planning process, as the AIA documents these steps, so being schematic design, design development, construction documentation, contract negotiation, and construction administration. And within each of these sub-chapters, we then ask questions, as you've already heard in the first 2 parts of this chapter, to bring in, for example, in schematic design, questions of the context, question of not a larger understanding of the context. Who are the stakeholders that are affected by a building design, for example, who have the benefit of using a building design, who are actors involved in the decision-making process, but then also questions of materiality that usually are better made in very early design stages, because these impact not only local but also global material flows, conditions in factories, extractive mining, so both global and local issues that lead to decisions of circularity, of material reuse, and the question how much, for example, of reused materials can we integrate in new construction, and what is the impact of a move like that on embodying justice. The design development then takes it one step further. The questions that we ask here are mostly about lifespan of material decisions, of construction and systems, the longevity of these buildings, and the associated decisions, and results on sort of carbon neutrality. And we really want to understand carbon neutrality here as a holistic question that focuses both on operational carbon reduction, but also embodied carbon. So bringing it back to questions of circularity and reuse, but always targeting sort of the larger context of these decisions to the communities that it affects, the users that it affects, and the material systems that are standing behind these decisions. The construction documentation and permitting section then actually addresses much more the process of how a building comes into its existence. So who is working on these construction sites, but also who is affected by the fact that there is a construction happening in a neighborhood. What does it mean for transportation, for road use, for pollution, to the neighboring properties, and how do we handle waste, specifically construction waste, which is another large component of our industry. The bidding and contract negotiation section talks a lot about a question of liability, procurement, and specifications, which are an integral part of the decision-making process when we talk about circularity aspects, but equally have an incredible amount of global and local impacts on questions of justice and equity. And the construction administration section then ends this chapter with considerations and questions about working conditions, the transportation of material, and again, global waste streams that are associated with the actual building, right, or the actual process of building of new structures. And I'll hand it back to Gretchen.
So the last part of the workbook, Pathways to Embodying Justice, includes examples of how justice is being incorporated and embedded in work that's now being done around the US. So we have examples from Austin, from Baltimore, Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, San Antonio, Savannah, Seattle. And these stories include programs that are initiated by city government. Some are initiated by community organizations and not-for-profits, and sometimes it's a partnership of both. And so these stories address a whole variety of issues and how justice has been embedded in these projects and programs. So they include community-based preservation, support for maintenance and repair of houses in vulnerable neighborhoods, workforce training to women as a pathway to home ownership and the resulting wealth creation, reuse as a way to create meaningful jobs and support for formerly incarcerated men, ways that histories of sites and materials are captured and honored and shared, reclaimed materials used to build ADUs for the unhoused, and city support for those experiencing code violations who may lack the resources to address them themselves. And so I personally found all of these stories inspiring, and I hope that they will also inspire you. And this is just a handful of work that's being done in the US, across the world, really, to integrate justice into municipal policies and practices. So I hope that you will take some inspiration away from them when you read those. And I will pass it over to, I think, Lauren.
Thank you, Gretchen. Hi, folks. My name is Lauren Zimmerman. I'm in the Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I use she, her pronouns, and I currently sit on our waste and recycling team. I was previously on our climate team working on an embodied carbon set of recommendations that I'll note later. So now, as the deconstruction program lead, I'll give you a little context on our program and some ways that we have tried to work equity and climate justice into our materials management. And, you know, an example of why this workbook is very particularly helpful for me. So this is an example of our demolition that was happening a lot prior to 2016. And in the center there, you can see a rally from community members that were really worried about the number of houses coming down, all those beautiful old houses, the materials being wasted, but also very particularly, you know, seeing lead dust specks in the air with these demolitions and worrying about the effects it's having to communities. If community has several demolitions happening, what type of toxics, pollutants are they being exposed to? So our city council directed us to find a way to help resolve the health impacts, the community impacts, save some of the materials, and slow the process down just enough that we had more community impact points for engagement. And so now houses and duplexes 1940 and older are required to be manually deconstructed instead of mechanically demolished. And you see an example of our sign on the right side there. Next slide. So here are some of the outcomes. Since 2016, we've had 800 house deconstructions. It's hard to believe. That has been 6.75 million pounds of lumber recovered for reuse. It's about 3,000 board feet of wood per house. And that is, you know, ceiling joist, floor joist, siding, flooring, just about everything, appliances, anything that we can pull for reuse either goes right back into our local lumber market or it goes to a community organization that sells the materials for low cost for home repairs. So to get this program running, we had 2 different trainings with over 30 participants total. And a big focus of ours was finding the folks who are underrepresented in our local construction industry, which included women, BIPOC community members, and folks who had barriers to employment. Working on circular materials and particularly deconstruction is an excellent avenue for employment in construction because you're learning to build a house in reverse by taking it apart. So it really represented a great entry point for a lot of folks to get into this industry. At this point, we have over 10 active companies in deconstruction, and we believe this created about 25 jobs locally. Next slide. So this is another program we have in conjunction with our Bureau of Development Services. They are our permitting and land use authority. The Access to Access program sought to find materials to apply to existing Empowered Neighborhoods program to partner with community-based organizations for home repair. So you can see this house, the before and after. This house needed some critical home repair, and this program supplied the materials to our other Empowered Neighborhoods program to connect volunteers, a CBO, and the materials to help this homeowner maintain their house and stay living in place. So for us, this program has been great because it's really about anti-displacement. Our Bureau of Development Services doesn't want to, you know, send people into liens or anything for code violations, kick people out of their homes. We want to keep people in their homes wherever we can. We also, have the preservation of our built history by keeping these neat old homes well maintained instead of turning over into, newer, larger homes that change the community. And then we also see those embodied carbon reductions by reusing materials if we can and maintaining the lifespan of a house. Next slide. So our work continues. Here's an example of some of our initiatives and roadmaps that are focused on materials and community impact. Our climate emergency workbook is our map for 2022 to 2025. Coming up soon, we will have a new climate planning session. And I'm looking forward to using this workbook for my own personal program. And that's the last thing listed here is deconstruction version 2.0 to see what that is going to be for the next phase of making sure that we are capturing as many materials as we can from deconstruction and getting them to the folks who need them the most. Thank you.
Yeah, just want to thank the panelists so far, and we have our credits and acknowledgements here. Feel free to use the QR code if you want to access the publication. We're now going to switch to a panel discussion of the guide and workbook led by Simone.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to the whole panel. What a tremendous effort this has been. It's really, truly impressive, both how broad the sort of the policy spectrum is in which we can really think about embedding justice in embodied carbon work. And it's really inspiring to hear already so many practical examples, and we're really excited that this is a guidebook that can really be picked up by city officers, community-based organizations, other community serving groups to really advance justice. And this is where I'd like to start with the panel discussion. I think what strikes me is that this workbook, this guide and workbook does an incredible job of really embedding justice. It's not a perspective of just how can we now take embodied carbon policy and try and reduce impacts or reduce harm, but it's actually positioning embodied carbon policy to advance justice in carbon neutral futures. So my first question is to Dr. Jocelyn Poe. If you could speak a little bit about how centering justice and equity is integral to advancing circularity and sustainability, and how this advances both justice and carbon neutrality.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. You really can't do one without the other. If you're advancing carbon neutrality, it requires a kind of higher level, non-narrow level looking at this question about distribution, right? Distribution of harms and benefits. And so if you have a narrow perspective or view of carbon neutrality, then you may be producing carbon neutrality for one place, but you're actually displacing the opposite of that in another place. And so it requires kind of a holistic view in order to really think through high level ideas about achieving carbon neutrality. Also, I think when we think about the climate crisis and its impacts, as we talked about, injustice is embedded into the built environment, and so are the climate the burdens of the climate crisis, right? And so in order to really address the issues that are coming out of the climate crisis, we have to address the uneven distribution of it. And we cannot do that without understanding injustices and justices and how they impact not just at the national level, but at the community level, neighborhood level, site level, home level, and thinking through not just how we can measure injustice either, but what are the lived experience of people who are working through or dealing with the impact of climate change, right? And I can, anybody else want to add on to that? I welcome other feedback.
Anyone else care to jump in on that question? Otherwise,
That's a brilliant
I'll
response.
yeah, please, Jenny, please.
No, I think that was a brilliant response. Couldn't put it better myself.
I agree, and the complexity is evident. We're talking about such complex ways of intervening in the system, everything from alternatives to demolition, which means looking at the complexities of the system that's already in place and the complexity of the system that of injustices that's already in place. That very place-based approach, but then moving also to then what to do with those resources in the resource management scheme, and then and moving on to even well, if we have to go to new construction, what does that really mean? Where are the injustices along the whole value chain here? It's really quite can seem daunting. So I'm wondering maybe to ask Jenny and Lauren Portland, considering how complex these systems are and the strategies require such sort of extensive engagement of multiple stakeholders, community-based organizations, communities directly, and so forth, in rethinking how work is done in cities. How do you get started? And Lauren, we've heard already some of these considerations being embedded in the work you're doing in Portland. But now that we have this guidebook, where do you really see sort of picking things up from here and moving your work forward? Jenny or Lauren, whoever would like to jump in first.
Sure. I think as with anything in planning, it's best to start early. But in the space of climate justice, I think cities have a little bit of intimidation of where to start. And also, as a process, we have a tendency to want to read something, then analyze it, then digest it for the team, then present. And I think the really valuable thing about this workbook is that you can just grab it, take it to a meeting and say, we're going to read this, we're going to go through some of the questions and just see what comes up, see what you realize you hadn't thought before, you hadn't thought about this priority population, that you didn't realize we had a whole other stakeholder group to engage with. So I think it really helps shake out the unknowns and just learn by doing.
I guess I would add, I think we tried to create a resource that has a lot of entry points. I think Lauren spoke to that. I mean, cities are working in different areas. There may be different strategies that they would want to start with first, or that make the most sense. I think in general, I would point out that it's really important to think collaboratively in approaching this. So action could start with an individual agency or city leader who is beginning to think about one particular area of action. And we tried to create something that was really practical, that paired abstract ideas or seemingly abstract ideas of justice that are really rooted in community. And then I would want to see agencies begin to work together. So working across city agencies and with community organizations. And so these questions are really aimed at helping to hold a dialogue. Another place to start could be community mapping. This is something that we suggest early in many of the questions. Some of that mapping is more specifically around past harms through demolition, but it's also community mapping and understanding the community, understanding the way that agencies work together, and ways to work together, and then also working with programs that may already have momentum and acknowledging the work that is going on within the community already, and really engaging with that work and deepening the work through asking these questions.
That's great. Thank you to you both. I really appreciate both the practical aspects of Lauren was highlighting of picking the guidebook up, bringing it to meetings, and beginning to sort of really just dig into some of the really specific, actionable questions that the book contains to really help policymakers think differently. And I also really like this point of the various, how it was sort of studied with various entry points in mind of sort of along sort of the different elements of value chains and planning and development processes, but also of the points of sort of you mentioned around community mapping and how to interact with various elements of community processes in these policy considerations. We've spoken about how in the justice framework the need to be place-based and how relevant that is, and we've mentioned it numerous times now already in sort of, you know, how to practically apply the guidebook and how to you know, even in the community mapping efforts, how place-based those need to be. So, you know, we at Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, we work across various geographies, and we often sort of are at a point of sort of trying to understand the complexity of interpreting some of these approaches and processes in widely differing contexts, both historically and juridically, and in terms of competencies and so forth. So I'd like to bring in both Gretchen and Felix in the following question. We know that this particular guidebook was developed with a framework that is very place-based, and that is specifically oriented towards the North American context. So I'm curious if you could tell us, both of you, if you could speak a little bit about how you feel this guidebook can be a resource for cities, communities, and stakeholders outside of North America, given the complex nature of being place-based. Who would like to jump in?
Felix, do you want to jump in?
Sure, happy to. So I think the answer to this is in the structure that we decided to give the workbook, because while admittedly the introduction of that workbook is very catered to the US context and the current context we live in here, the fact that we decided to ask questions is actually a very universal approach, because the question is meant to trigger a place-based solution and understand the location and the locality and the sort of context that this lives in. And so our hope is that by specifically sort of developing a structure that doesn't provide the solution yet, but it tries to trigger a place-based solution through an interaction and through a guided sort of methodology, that in the end, this workbook is actually universally applicable and actually triggers solutions across many different contexts.
And I would just add that all cities everywhere have historic injustices and inequities, and all cities everywhere have a big role to play in carbon neutrality. And so there, as has been mentioned, there are various entry points into this workbook and into the justice considerations, into the different areas of, you know, treatment of our built environment. And so I would hope that somewhere for every city, every local government, there's an entry point that starts to spark conversation, that starts to inspire people to do more, better, interesting, innovative work that answers some of these issues about justice and carbon neutrality. And I also just want to point out that, you know, while we're talking about cities, we hope that this can be useful to towns, to villages, to counties, to states, to community organizations. So we really tried to think about all of the different stakeholders who can participate in this effort to embed justice more deeply into the built environment.
Thank you both. That really resonates with I think the approach we generally like to take in helping cities to think through the policy development process across different contexts. This idea of framing with questions that are, I think, as you mentioned, as both mentioned, kind of broadly universal. The inequities and systemic injustices that pervade all geographies kind of lend themselves to this kind of approach of questioning in the local context how to approach the policy development and not defining the solutions from from a predetermined kind of perspective. I think is really helpful. We were in conversations in a conference workshop setting, I should say, just the other day with a city in Southern Africa and discussing some of these very questions around the nexus of built environment and embodied carbon and justice, and the questions seem to resonate across geographies. So I can say that we've already seen some instances of other geographies, and again, not just geographies, but also with different types of stakeholders and different types and different levels of governance, and really taking this approach and applying it in the local context. So that's really exciting. Another question for Lauren I'd like to pose is, one of the first questions we often hear from city officers is sort of, these types of processes, these types of approaches require extensive engagement, required, extensive effort and initiative from city officers, from various stakeholders, and beyond, from communities, et cetera. And that's hard to sort of pull together. How do you find funding for this kind of engagement work, participatory processes, and really finding the time and the space and the opportunity for different types of groups and communities and organizations to be involved in these kinds of processes?
Yeah. Thankfully, many of our federal funding sources are starting to focus on climate action. So, for example, the Community Change Grant from the EPA focuses on community level impact. Within, they have a disadvantaged community map to target communities for deeper investments because they were previously disinvested in. And they also, their climate action includes focusing on solid waste reduction and promoting material circularity. So I'm really grateful to see this tide is reaching into the EPA. But, that's just a one-time grant. So another example would be, we're trying to look at how to treat our goals of material circularity with circular funding. So how can we displace, for example, some of our commercial waste fees, earmark them for reuse and material circularity, so that the more we consume reuse things, and trying to get that funding to match the purpose of what it's doing. But the best option beyond a one-time grant or even that ongoing funding is to just build community into your government structure. So, for example, the city of Portland, we're going through a government restructure, which is large. I do and don't recommend it for many reasons, but one of the great opportunities it gave us is that our sustainability work is completed across all sorts of bureaus, departments all across the city. And so we're developing a sustainability and climate commission that will help have oversight and guide our work. And that is a great place to embed this work into, because one, community is right there. We're getting their voice on everything. We've also reserved a number of the commission seats for youth so that we have youth engagement in climate action. And because they will be built into our structures, one, thankfully, these folks are willing to volunteer their time from their organizations. And so it is not a huge budget increase in terms of staffing. but it is ongoing without requiring much extra organization or budget for, a one-time program or a one-time exploration around equity. So I would say that is a great opportunity to find a way to bring your community partners just into your ongoing work instead of it being a every now and then touch point.
Thanks so much. That super helpful insight to how to make this a long-standing commitment within policy development and implementation. I want to be mindful of how much time we have left, and want to save room for some interaction with our guests and audience. So I think, Jenny, maybe are you interested in sharing, posing a question to those folks who are still here? Yeah.
Absolutely. I'd love to pose a question. And also another shout out to Ash Kopetsky, who is one of the authors of the report, PhD researcher, and Christine O'Malley. I see you're here too with Historic Ithaca and the Crowd Network. So I invite you to chime in on the conversation as well. But what I wanted to do was pose a question to the audience, as well as Lauren. So we're thrilled that you're thinking about applying the Embodying Justice framework, that you're interested in it. And we're wondering, what might you do next, and how will you document your work in centering justice and equity in embodying justice? And I hope that, I'd like to open that up for discussion amongst audience members, if you feel comfortable in engaging with that and asking more questions as well, because we'd love to hear back from you and get feedback on what you're thinking about doing.
Who would like to jump in? Any volunteers?
I'm happy to kick off.
That's great.
So I moved from an embodied carbon focus role to my deconstruction role just in the last few months. And this workbook is really helpful for me, one, because it's focused on waste and circularity. So it's my workspace. But also, so we have an internal equity toolkit that helps us do an equity analysis on any of our program planning, but it's really broad. It covers kind of anything that could come up in our bureau, from planning to waste to our climate action team. And so sometimes the questions, you're like, well, this kind of hits what I'm trying to work on, but it's not specific enough. So for me, this is super helpful that this workbook focuses on waste and circularity, because you get both benefits. You get the topical information, and then you get the questions and framework of how to explore it. So for me, a big one on how to use this and document it and work across the city is that it's not always easy to explain all the parts we need to work together for material circularity and to ensure we are centering community and how to do this work. And so being able to hand this to the planners in my own bureau or our permitting office and just build that shared language of how to approach this is really meaningful. It builds the sustainability in, it builds equity in. And I would say one way that this is going to be really critical is, as city policymakers, our work is really cyclical based on election cycles, local activism, grants we have, just different things going on. And then we have, in this space, this overlay of the American construction and development market too. So I think one thing that has been a problem in the past for many cities, our city, and not just cities, smaller jurisdictions too, is that we get really excited to ride the economic boost of a development cycle, and then we make a bunch of really bad mistakes, and then we say, oh, we're out of money to solve those mistakes. So that's not going to happen for a while. And so I think this workbook really keeps you ahead of that. Like, I am planning to review a bunch of these questions in terms of what will this look like for the deconstruction program in a low construction development cycle versus a high one, and what are the different outcomes of that? Who are different stakeholders? What would be the effects? And I think this really helps have that language to have those discussions with all of my internal city stakeholders, and then to go beyond to metropolitan, other organizations, and really have a better strategy that's longer term.
For the response, and I see Zara, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes, I'm using my cell phone, so I'm not sure how is the quality, but I just wanted to first thank you for this work. It's been very inspiring, very great to see all the I love the aspect that you guys, as you said, like pose the questions. The thing I'm like, I guess I discussed this briefly as you were developing it, and maybe at that I find it fascinating that based on where each of us are and the area that we can influence, how it will impact us. Because and it's actually very interesting. I can hear from what you're sharing that like you acknowledge that it really depends on, like, city is not an identical, like a whole thing. It's like the individuals within it and where they are focusing and where they can impact. So I'm in, like, what I'm questioning and curious to understand is like, how can we acknowledge the fact that, like, depending on which department you're in within a city or which area you're focusing on, you really have a different level of impact. Just as an example, I'm with the city of Vancouver in the role to help our embodied carbon policies. So it's interesting to me to hear, like, Lauren, the shift that Lauren has done now into the waste, so she will have more direct impact. But something I have been exploring is, again, like, we have put embodied carbon policies and we have used our building code, which is not a very common thing, it's a unique thing. But what I'm looking at now is like, well, okay, like, we have this code that requires low embodied carbon, but does it tackle the construction and salvaging enough? Because if you're using embodied carbon as a tool, does it measure it enough? And well, I think it's quite known that for now, our tools do not reflect the value of the construction as much as it could have. Like, it has, as we reuse, the tool uses or shows the less material used, so it shows the benefit, but maybe not, it does not the full picture or the justice on how to present the impact of it. So I'm looking at, like, can we kind of like add in incentive tools to encourage the construction, encourage reuse or salvaging, even if it's not on the same site, which is the challenge, right? Like, if you are asking it and build new building to deconstruct and salvage, but they cannot use it on their own site, they would not get the credit, right? So my question is, how can we link all of these in a way that we use our policy tools, even if our quantitative tools do not show it? So that's something that I'm kind of like asking myself and looking around, and I like this framing, and I'm looking forward to maybe look into this and see if that kind of like posing of question can help. But again, like, the interconnection within each city or region, and also identifying where the tools fall short or where the area of impact of each policy falls short, and how can we connect and impact them or help build on each other, is something that I love how this book is touching on. But I'm also looking forward to see, as you said, that lens of justice on other areas that the embodied carbon work that CNCA has done is touching on and maybe are not very well connected or are not touched on like how they can be connected.
I'm really happy to hear your comments. I think that's such an important point, and I really love that if there's challenge to quantitative measures, certainly our quantitative measures really need to be in the service of what needs to happen to transform the way cities work for carbon neutrality and more just futures. I can also see by the way Felix was writing, he may have more to say about that.
I was taking notes so that we can take that into the next version of the book. So thank you for that comment. And I fully agree. I think the better understanding of where carbon metrics fall short in analyzing and making decisions on the building level and on the city level in this current move is influential and super important and timely. And so I think that's something that we all need to kind of put our heads together and maybe share these metrics much more to understand the benchmark and then the possible build-ups on that towards many of these aspects that we've covered today. But I think Megan also has a question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Megan with the Carbon Leadership Forum. Thank you guys so much for all your great work. And Lauren and Zara are part of our regional hubs, so it's great to see them as part of this work as well. And I guess I have a question just kind of zooming out a little bit and just thinking about how to talk about this sort of resource and work with practitioners, policymakers, construction industry in places where embodied carbon and environmental justice are not forefront of policies and forefront of research in mind. My perception might be a little bit skewed of how to do this, just because Lauren and Zara come from two, at least for CLF's point of view, regional hubs are like local chapter communities, and those are both two really active, really engaged embodied carbon hubs. So I know that their work is a little bit more open to kind of taking on this sort of research and ideas. And then, CLF is looking to expand into areas where there isn't that much work. So specifically looking at like the US Southeast, where there isn't a ton of sustainable policy and environmental justice work going on. And this feels like a really valuable tool that, as we kind of are working into areas where that isn't the case, would be really valuable to like showcase. So I guess I'm wondering, more than just the typical like how to talk to people about environmental justice and climate policy and environmental policy, with this specifically, have you found any approaches, or were any of like the practice examples in areas where that was kind of the political and social climate, or have y'all thought about that in any way? Kind of a loaded question, but yeah, just wondering if there's any thinking on that.
Hi, Megan. I can jump in first because most of my work is done in Mississippi, the Southeast. And nobody there believes that climate justice is a real thing, or that the climate crisis is a real thing. I'm exaggerating. People do believe that. I think one of the strategies that I and the communities that I work with, there's a couple of different ones. One, there are people on the ground who are interested, and so we find ways to support them, right? And that usually comes from outside resources like yourself. And so I think going through a deeper dive, understanding the context on the ground, making sure that you're grounded in community there, you will find people who are interested, and you can support the work they're doing and help them, because they know how to speak to their own context, help them communicate to the people they need to communicate. Another approach is when we do it specifically when it comes to elected officials that we need support. is not to use all of the loaded terms, right? And so they're mostly interested in dollars in Mississippi specifically. And so making an argument about how this is going to save money, save time, save insurance rates, save votes is really important. In the work that we do, we'll do all of that. When you think about even just the questions around reuse and material reuse, people are interested in that because it saves, right? People are less interested in what that might do to the climate, but that's one thing that you focus on. And so it's a little bit about using the language that people get most excited about. And then the other approach, which is more radical, is to not care, right? And just do the work. And so finding, again, those resources, those people who are just doing the work and maybe even have a target on their back. I think a part of remedying justice is to be able to protect those people, right? And think about resources that would help protect them who are doing the work, that don't care and who are going up against politicians, policymakers, people in power, to create a better future. So how do we think through protecting them and providing them and bolstering them with resources?
Thanks.
I'd like to add a little bit to that too. Thanks, Felix. That's something I talk about in the beginning of our deconstruction program. No one was trying to save 2x4s. That wasn't the point of it. And they were certainly not trying to save 2x4s for the 0.003 whatever CO2 equivalent, you know. It was really a like public health outcry. And we purposely framed our program to be guided by the public market for materials and having private firms, and so folks could, you know, solve the market themselves, that we didn't need a bunch of buy-in or investment necessarily. The deconstruction contractors do the work and we have one regulation that causes it to happen. So I very much agree with Jocelyn about like the money, the dollars, you know, this is something we talk about in the Pacific Coast Collaborative Low Carbon Construction Group too, is how do we get past the sustainability values for other propositions? And a lot of that is the economic development benefits. And or for me, I also like that this space offers a celebration of not building. It would be great if we all start questioning, why are we even building in the first place? Can you look like a responsible citizen, developer, politician, whoever, by not spending money and managing the assets you already have, and what that looks like on the massive scale of asset management, insurance, all that. Go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something very similar. There is potentially a different reading of the workbook where you don't say, well, we have these carbon policies, have you also considered this and that? But we don't care about carbon at the moment. We have other issues that we want to address when thinking about injustices here and there. Maybe carbon metrics are one way of helping with a solution, because carbon metrics right now have funding, for example, or carbon metrics have ways of addressing certain policy questions that other topics might not have. And so maybe there's a way to read this in two different directions to help the cause on both sides.
I'm not sure if I'm seeing Zara and then Gretchen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Felix was saying. I think I maybe just wanted to clarify that I do agree with Lauren that some of the studies that have looked into the embodied carbon, like the carbon value of the reuse, especially when you look at materials like wood, may not show as much significance in that. When it goes to the reuse portion, it would, but when it's in the deconstruction and saving it from landfill, maybe it's not as much. And again, it's questionable whether that quantitation is accurate. But put that aside, my point was, how can we use these policies to build on each other? So for example, again, if I'm building an embodied carbon regulation, if I'm just quantifying embodied carbon, I'm not going to incentivize deconstruction because it wouldn't show it. So my point is, how can we take that opportunity now and add on top of it incentives that merge this and revive another opportunity for deconstruction and salvaging and reuse? So again, like what I'm exploring right now, and maybe offline I can maybe even ask for your input on it, is like, I'm providing this specific incentive of, for example, 2% reduction of embodied carbon if you deconstruct the building on site, no matter how much your quantity shows reduction. So my question is like, if I'm head down on developing an embodied carbon regulation or code and do not see this opportunity, that's a loss of opportunity in using the climate policies to help this, which will have the justice implication, will have waste reduction implication. So again, to me, it's like, I love the whole framing of questioning, but it's also, I love the idea of, let's identify where different policies and different departments in a city can build on the other group responsibility. So again, as an example, developing an embodied carbon reporting in a regulation does not directly mean I will require deconstruction, but I have that opportunity. So again, to me, it's more identifying where we can support these different priorities, which are inherently not different, but when you are working on each of them in a silo, you may not identify where they can give another support to the other one. So like maybe where I'm coming from is City of Vancouver's effort on deconstruction has, maybe we have done work not as successful as Portland, but again, like, to me, when I'm developing our like version 2 of embodied carbon regulation, I'm like, can I use this now to help that and give it another push? And that's what I'm raising, in that even if quantitatively it doesn't show it, or when we are like head down on waste and like, oh, it's like, oh, the climate, it doesn't connect, to me, it's like making sure, and again, like coming back to the amazing work you guys have done, identifying practical solutions of where we can link these together is maybe the point I was raising from my question.
Given where we are with time, I'm wondering if we should have a final question from Sam and maybe some final thoughts from Gretchen before wrapping up. Does that make sense to folks?
Great.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed listening to the session this afternoon, and I suppose I kept really quiet and really to the end, and because I'm joining from Glasgow, Scotland, and felt very out of context with the conversations you're having in a US sense. But I found them resonating extremely well with what's happening in Scotland at the moment. Maybe my understandings around definitions of justice, blurring of language, I was trying to get my head around, but we're all following the same issue, focusing on the same issues. Embodied carbon, I'm a embodied carbon assessor with a building consultant, but embodied carbon is just a number. It's the number that gives us a quantity, but you need a narrative to go with it. And ultimately, there's so many narratives you can write into policy and purpose. I think this is why it will be different in Scotland to where it is with yourselves. It'll be different in Germany, it'll be different in Japan, but we're all facing this change in construction. Fundamentally for me, I think the pivot to the circular economy is still something that is relatively new to many in the industry who prefer business as usual. Sadly, I still see a lot of sites that we are advocating on demolishing a whole ton of stuff before any demolition audit's been taken place or any high value items removed. But it's promising to see a number of manufacturers who are looking at the wider circular economy and cascading principles of high value uses. But I suppose that comes back where there's economic interest rather than social interest. And I think what's quite warming to hear from the conversation today is that that rooted in community and social benefits as well as the economic. So I kind of just wanted to jump off my screen for a second and say hi, because I've been listening intently and somewhat, hopefully I've captured as much as I can from it. But yeah, there's probably a bunch of stuff in UK legislation around value-added tax on demolition of existing buildings, where existing buildings get charged 20% tax and new builds don't. So there's a presumption in tax regulation to charge you more for the new build. There's mad stuff that we're trying to overcome, but certainly welcome any further conversations around maybe what's transferable between our two contexts.
Thank you so much. I hope that we can check in with you and extend that conversation. Great.
I just wanted to come back to Megan's question about reaching communities, engaging communities that maybe are not on board yet in terms of climate, in terms of the environment, in terms of justice. And to go back to, I think, one of the main points of the workbook, which is very much about place-based solutions and place-based approaches. Certainly agreeing with Jocelyn and others on here that leading with the economic issue in these places is really a much better strategy than the environmental, and understanding that they will come together. But you know, some cities have issues with affordable housing. Some cities have issues with workforce development and job creation. Some have reuse. They have too many materials, and reuse is a great way to get these priority communities, these hard to reach populations involved in a circular construction economy. And so again, this place-based solution and realizing that in this work, there are so many different touch points that you can enter. And maybe it's not initially policy, maybe it's not initially coming from a city government. And so I hope that that's one of the things that this workbook can do, is to provide some strategies for dealing with, you know, with hard to reach or hard to engage communities around this work.
Thank you all. May I say one last thing? Thanks for joining us. And also justice and equity and circularity, carbon neutrality, these are all highly hyper-local, but they're also interlinked. We're dealing with a climate crisis that is global, and places and conditions of justice are reciprocal. Our landscapes are reciprocal. We extract to make the built environment, or we're circular, and we feed from the local economy and local social conditions. So I hope that we can keep all of our places linked positively and addressed in the kind of reparative vision that Jocelyn is talking about within our localities, and working together and linked in a more just and equitable way.
Thanks so much for that final thought, Jenny. I think that that really closes the loop here on many of the considerations we touched upon today. I know we're well over the time we had allocated, so I just want to take a second to thank the entire team and all the folks who contributed to this work. Once again, we're very excited to bring it out to many communities, share it out widely, and offer opportunities and pathways for very many different types and levels of stakeholders to really take on these place-based approaches. So a huge thank you to the whole team that contributed. A huge thank you to all the presenters today. Another big thank you to Laura and Zara for contributing along from a city perspective along the way. And a big thank you to the audience who has made it through a long, but I think very inspiring and insightful session. We look forward to evolving this work further and to new iterations and new efforts aimed at other parts of the policy framework and interpreting our policy framework more fully and across different geographies. And so we'll keep everyone posted on those developments. But thank you once again. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all.
Thank you.